My name is Ross King. I am a student of Korean language and writing, the history of Korean language and writing. And if we start with just really simple personal background, I grew up in Wisconsin in the United States. My parents were English immigrants, came to the United States in 1957, both highly educated at Cambridge University. Long story how my father ended up in Wisconsin. He's a surgeon, still alive. And I mention all this because growing up in what then was a fairly all-white and rather boring and rather intellectually unstimulating place in a smallish town in Wisconsin, my parents were very eager that I not put down any roots there, and so from a young age they would always send me off to various camps and programs, other kinds of extracurricular activities, one of which in the summers was language camp, or the language villages in northern Minnesota. And so from age 11 till age 18, every summer, all summer long, I was either at the Russian village called Lesnoya Ozera, or the Spanish village called El Lago del Bosque, or German, which was called Waldsee. And thanks to those language villages, got very interested in foreign languages. And then when it came time to go to university, well, I should say also, as soon as they could, they sent me off to boarding school. So starting from grade 9 until the end of high school. So for 4 years I was at a boarding school in New Hampshire, quite a good one, called Phillips Exeter Academy, where I was also able to take Russian. Russian is very unusual to be able to take Russian in high school in the United States, and he still is. So I was taking Russian and German and French and Spanish. So again, the combination of the language villages in the summer, which were lots of fun, with more academic study at this boarding school, all the way through high school, gave me this pretty strong background in several different languages, including Russian, which then I took to university. And so when I went to university, I matriculated at Yale. So graduated from high school in 1979. Went on to Yale for 4 years of undergraduate education, majored in linguistics and political science, and branched out because there were more opportunities to take other kinds of languages, non-Indo-European languages, more exotic languages. So I took Arabic and Turkish, Japanese, and of course they did not teach Korean at the time. Korean was extremely underrepresented in North American universities. This is in the 1980s. And so Yale didn't teach it, but the chair of the linguistics department at that time was Samuel Martin, who is a distinguished expert, or he's passed on now, he died in 2009. He is an expert in Japanese and Korean. I took a class from him in my second year at university on descriptive linguistics, where our informant for the term, I should say, field methods. How to essentially elicit and analyze linguistic data from speakers in the field from a language that you do not know. And so the whole semester we worked with a Korean student from Korea who was studying at Yale, and that was my first kind of academic introduction to Korean. And as I say, Professor Martin, he was teaching the course. He was also the chair of the linguistics department. He liked the work that I did in that class, and he found funding for me to send me to Korea in the summer for the summer vacation after my second year of university. So I came to Korea, it was 1981. For the first time, I think I have that right. So it was the year after the Gwangju uprising that I came here. In the summer, had no idea whatsoever about Korea, just this interest in the language, more sort of an intellectual interest. was very clueless when I first came here. I started, the only 6 weeks of formal instruction that I ever took in Korean was that summer. There was a famous, now defunct, language institute that trained Catholic missionaries called the Myeongdo Ohagwon. That also had a very excellent series of textbooks that were very highly regarded for quite some time. So the Myeongdo Ohagwon was next to the old MBC headquarters, the broadcasting. And I attended for 6 weeks, and in my second year at Yale, again with funding from the Department of Linguistics, more or less arranged by Professor Martin, he found money for me to hire a one-on-one tutor to work with me, and we worked through Samuel Martin's textbook called Beginning Korean, which nobody of course uses now. It's entirely in Romanization, in Yale Romanization, and a very sort of technical linguistic Romanization, so Koreans look at it and go, this isn't Korean. But I was able to read it just fine, and anyway, I worked with this very nice student. She was like a 1.5 generation Korean immigrant student, Helen Kahn. She's a lawyer in San Francisco now. So I had this entire textbook sort of inputted into my head before I went to Korea. And so got to Korea, but of course I really had not a lot of opportunities to practice Korean. So I went to this Myeongdo Ohagwon. I entered in level 1, and then 6 weeks later finished their level 6. And then that was the highest you could go. And after that I just was self-taught. And so that's kind of the only formal linguistic or formal training in Korean that I ever had, just because at the time there really wasn't much available. And then finished Yale in 1983, came back to Korea for a few months, spent some time in Taiwan, spent some time in Japan, basically learning Chinese and Japanese to a better level, and in the meantime applied to graduate school, and then entered Harvard's department for the MA and PhD in 1984, which is also the year I met my wife, Hyoshin Kim, who was already studying at Harvard at the time. And then, although I was at Harvard in the linguistics department, was still being supervised by Samuel Martin, who was at Yale, still teaching. And yeah, what else can I say about the personal trajectory? I mean, that's sort of the short version. People always ask me why Korean, or what got you excited about Korean, and that was a couple things. Already in high school, at this boarding school that I attended, which was full of really very high-achieving, very bright students from all over the United States and all over the world, every morning in assembly, we would sit for half an hour, and there would be some guest speaker or something like this. And we sat alphabetically, and so my last name being King, to the left of me there were several students with the name Kim. To my right were lots of Lees, and behind me sat David Moon, who was on the swim team with me, and then in front of me was Ginny Jun, who spelled her name J-U-H-N, who also went to Yale and is now a professor of economics in Houston. So I was surrounded by Korean Americans as a student, and never really was particularly close to any of these Korean American students, but was always very curious about them, because it's just, we didn't have any diversity in Wisconsin where I grew up, and just would always look and say, who are these Koreans? Where did they come from? Why are there so many of them? Because they're not a huge presence in American immigrant life, but they're really overrepresented in these very high-achieving schools, like my boarding school. So I was just kind of curious about that. But then after my first year at university, that first summer after university, I think it was, I spent a summer at University of California, Berkeley, doing a 10-month-long intensive course in Mandarin Chinese. And every morning I would, or every afternoon, whenever it was, there was a cafe, one of my favorite cafes, where I would go to study my Chinese, lessons. And one day I remember there was a girl sitting to the table, sitting at the table to my left, who was obviously Korean, but she was writing a letter. And she had this notepad out, and was writing this letter in in Korean in Hangul, and it just struck me as incredibly beautiful the way she was also quite attractive. But what was more interesting was the sort of Hangul that was flowing out of the tip of her pen. Just was very intriguing to me, and that was right at the time when I had realized actually I really want to learn Korean, and I was taking Chinese because there was nothing else to take at Berkeley that summer, but I wanted to be at Berkeley. So anyway, I just, that was really fascinating to me, just the way it looked as it was coming out of the end of the pen. So anyway, I guess my point is that my interest in Korean was really initially intellectual, which makes me different. And so one sort of, I guess, interesting or kind of unusual point about my trajectory is that I'm basically the first person to become a professor in Korean studies in North America that did not come out of either a missionary background, a military background, an espionage background, or the Peace Corps. Those were really the only four trajectories. Everybody above me, who's basically 62 or older, and that is not ethnically Korean, that is doing Korean studies in North America, was one of those four trajectories. Either a spy, a military person, a missionary, or Peace Corps. And so I think I was the first person to kind of come at it really just out of intellectual curiosity. So anyway, I went there that first time, the first summer, and that was also a kind of rude awakening for me, because I got there and it turned out I was doing a homestay, and the place I was living was right across the street from what is now Sungsil University, Sungsil 대학교. At the time, not a particularly distinguished university, but I think it's gotten a lot better. But my point is that I thought, oh great, I'm living right across from a university. I will, be able to make friends with my peers, with fellow university students. And so as soon as I could, I went across the street and sort of walked around the campus and did indeed meet some students, male students, that were all talking, and was kind of shocked to, well, two things shocked me. One was I realized that my Korean was nowhere good enough to have a conversation with my peers about subjects that really mattered. And two, I got a very, very cold and hostile reaction. Because I was completely oblivious to the fact that the Gwangju uprising had just recently taken place, and that I didn't understand Korean politics, and this was of course when all the demonstrations were happening and Americans were perceived as sort of having been behind Gwangju and behind of course Chundu-hwan and so on. And so I got a really hostile reaction from these Korean students. So I sort of said, okay, maybe I have to change my plan. Maybe I shouldn't be talking to students just yet. I'm not ready. And so then, that summer, the other connection I had was somebody I knew managed to get me a pass to get onto the US 8th Army base. And I think I mentioned earlier I was on the swim team in high school, I was playing water polo in college, and I was needing to work out. I needed to swim. And there was a very nice swimming pool on the US 8th Army base, which I was able to access with this pass that a friend got for me. And so, as it turns out, right there next to the swimming pool, there was a barber shop. And the barber shop had anywhere from 3 to 5 ajumas working there all day long, from like 6 a.m. until late in the evening, whose job it was to cut the hair of any military service personnel that used the pool, which was zero. Nobody came. I usually had the entire swimming pool to myself, and so I would do my workout and then spent literally the entire day just hanging out in this barber shop with these ajumas who had absolutely no interest in learning English, who spoke no English, and had nothing better to do than just bend my ear and sort of speak Korean to me all day. And that in some ways was the single most intensive and useful training in learning how to speak Korean that I had ever. It was at this barber shop on the US 8th Army base. So somewhat unusual way to learn Korean, but that's what happened. And that was actually really very, very helpful. So anyway, after that I just kept, Korean is a huge investment, takes a lot of time, and I'm still learning it. So after I graduated from Yale, where of course I couldn't take Korean, I went back, I took more, and then in graduate school, starting in 1984 at Harvard, again I didn't take courses in Korean language because I was kind of beyond whatever they could offer, but did research, and I also was able to come back to Korea for a year as a Fulbright scholar, where I spent a year at Seoul National University from 1986 to 1987, which was again a very difficult time. There were lots of, I didn't go to campus very often because there were often demonstrations, and if they saw an American, and you're again not very welcome. But I did meet some fellow students in the Kugo Kumunakwa, the Department of Korean Language and Linguistics, or Language and Literature, who are now sort of leaders in that field as professors here in Korea today, that I'm still in touch with. So that was 1 year here in Korea, and then I went back after. Well, no, how did it work? Just before I came in 1986 to Korea, which was in the fall, I came here, to start the fall semester. I attended a conference in Tashkent in the summer of 1986. Gave a paper about Manchu writing, met Sasha Vovin at that conference, who he's the same age as me and just recently passed away, quite unfortunately, but was also interested in Altaic linguistics, Korean, Japanese. We had very similar interests. But so we're at this conference in Tashkent, and I noticed, so during the break time, it was the in-tourist hotel where we were staying, there was a big bazaar behind the hotel, and so I wandered around the bazaar, and then in one corner of this bazaar, I noticed there were some old ladies sitting, and they, I had to look a couple times because I couldn't believe what I was seeing, but I saw they were Korean halmonis, Korean old ladies, selling kimchi, and I thought, what the hell? Because I didn't know anything about Koreans in the Soviet Union. And so, I went up and I spoke to some of these old ladies, and I tried to speak to them in Korean, which didn't work very well because I spoke Seoul Korean, and and they didn't, and they spoke Koryomat. And so anyway, I thought this was very interesting, and I made an arrangement to come back the next day to interview and to record one of the ladies, one of the more talkative, sort of outgoing ladies who was there. Her name was Ten, Mrs. Ten, so Chun-shi, and spent a couple hours interviewing her, and then after the conference was over, I continued on to Korea to begin my Fulbright scholarship, and then in the fall collected all of the publications that were available about Hamgyong dialect, published by Korean scholars, and there wasn't much. And then wrote basically the first paper published it in 1987 about Soviet Korean, based on this conversation, this interview with this woman, and was able to show that it was basically a form of northeastern Hamgyong dialect with lots of interesting admixture with Russian, and so on. And so wrote essentially the first academic paper about Koryomat in 1987 while I was in grad school, and that was published here in Korea. And so after that initial experience, then I continued collecting materials, and when I went back to Harvard after that year here in Korea, applied for additional funding to go to Russia, to go to the Soviet Union to do research and to do more field work. And that was actually quite complicated because I was trying to get placed. This is through something called IREX, which was the official government-to-government educational exchange, and it still exists, I think. But so the idea is you apply and you ask to be placed at a certain university, and I asked to be placed at the university in Tashkent. But apparently this was considered too sensitive. I did not get permission. It was delayed for over a year. And finally they came back with a compromise that says, we can't place you in Tashkent, but if you like, we can place you in Leningrad. And so I said, sure, why not? And so I went to Leningrad in 1989. Of course, this is now, as the Soviet Union is basically falling apart. And by this point, I'm married with Kim Hyo-shin, a South Korean national. She still had a South Korean passport. And so we were in Leningrad at the university, and then, of course, I managed to find a way to do a field trip to Almaty, which was easier than getting to Tashkent. For some reason, they just didn't want to let me go to Tashkent no matter what. And so I ended up in Almaty for several months, as sort of a nakamandirovku from the university in Leningrad. And that's where I met German Kim and his wife Zara, and that's where everything starts. And so we had a wonderful several months, basically, and at that point it seems it was all, I caught Gera at a time when he too was more or less finished with his dissertation and kind of waiting, I guess, for a defense. I can't remember now, but anyway, Gera had plenty of time and was also interested in talking to these old ladies, and we visited, you know, various collective farms, met lots of people, made lots of recordings and interviews, and that kind of you know, fed into my dissertation research. Except that dialect work like that is so time-consuming to transcribe that instead of writing a dissertation about the living dialect, what I did was went back and wrote a dissertation about the Russian print sources from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, of which there are quite many. And so my dissertation was about Russian sources on Korean dialects, but written sources, not on these recorded, you know, spoken materials, which I still have and which I still haven't really managed to publish properly. And so after that, yeah, I mean, that sort of gets you, that takes us up to about 1990. I got my first job. I got a job in England at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Even before I finished my PhD, actually finished the PhD while I was still in London, and I think I graduated in 1991 with my degree. And so that kind of is the trajectory from childhood up until I finished my PhD and got my first job. Had already kind of discovered this interest in the Koryo Saram, but especially Koryo Ma, their language. Met Gera Kim, started to do lots of collaboration and so on.